the Ahlert. He's a former New York Post op-ed columnist and currently contributing to the JewishWorldReview.com, Patriot Post, HumanEvents.com, and CanadaFreePress.com, as well as FrontPageMag.com. And Arnold, I thought of you when David Brat was found to be victorious over Eric Cantor. And we had so many discussions about one John Boehner actually a little while back and the push for amnesty. And we've talked about it over the months through your great work in exposing what amnesty costs, the reality of what's happening currently with immigration, illegal immigration, and the lack of enforcement of our laws. This is what John Boehner said in February of this year. And it was caught on tape, and we have it.
I know what you're going to play.
It's only for you. It's a long-distance dedication, my friend. Roll it.
Whether we're going to get to it this year or not. I think we should, but the appetite amongst my colleagues for doing this is not real good. And this guy's back here with a camera, but here's the attitude. Oh, don't make me do this. Oh, this is too hard. You should hear him. You know, we get elected to make choices.
We get elected to make choices. Yeah. Your thoughts? Was it the amnesty that pushed him out?
Well, I certainly think it was. At least a large part of it was. You could also make the case that he was seen as another big government insider, despite his conservative credentials. He spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. I'm sure that was a contributing factor. But I have to believe that timing is everything, and it certainly didn't help that his primary, the night of the vote, is during the week when our southern border is literally being assaulted by people who have obviously gotten the word, just like Bob Barker used to say, come on down, come to America. If you get to America, you can stay in America. And I think that's what ultimately did him in.
Explain what is taking place at the border, because it's been described as a manufactured crisis at the border. What's happening exactly right now? And you mentioned the reasons behind that. Elaborate if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I call it the Cloward-Piven approach to illegal immigration reform. For those of your listeners who don't know who Cloward and Piven were, they were academics from I believe, an Ivy League school, and they posited the theory that in order to bring down capitalism, the best way to do it would be to overload the system so as to make it completely unresponsive to the people. And I would maintain that what the Obama administration is either tacitly or maybe in some cases overtly encouraging is overloading the border and crashing the system to the point where they are now moving illegal aliens into military bases, not just next to the border, by the way. There have also been reports that they are now moving them to bases in places like Maryland and New York. So my feeling is this may be part of a strategy to establish de facto towns, for lack of a better word, and maybe lay the groundwork for Obama to say, look, we can't possibly send these people, especially since they're children, we can't possibly send them back across the border, so we might as well learn to live with this.
And you've broken down the numbers in your piece.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of kids we're talking about here. We're talking about this year, they're looking at possibly as many as 90,000. And that number is expected to rise to as many as 142,000 of what they call unaccompanied alien children, UACs. And just to give your listeners some perspective's sake, fewer than 40,000 children were apprehended in 2013.
When the president and obviously people who have made it here are communicating with others and saying, hey, look, we're here. It's okay. Come. You're not going to be thrown out. what's you talked about collapsing capitalism, but in the sense of elections, what does it do when you have, if we have amnesty? What will it do electorally, and what does it mean for those who are fans of capitalism and believe in free market capitalism, because you've got some pretty strange alliances, I'll put it that way.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, free market capitalism versus what I call crony capitalism, or in this case, what the Chamber of Commerce wants, which is cheap labor capitalism, as cheap as they can get it. I think is the ultimate plan here. They talk about comprehensive immigration reform because we have to fill the jobs that Americans refuse to do. And it's my feeling that if we're going to have any kind of comprehensive reform, perhaps we should have comprehensive welfare system reform where able-bodied Americans who are collecting a check might be employed in some of those jobs that Americans otherwise refuse to do, or we can cut through the euphemism and maybe get to the point that the reason Americans refuse to do those jobs is because they're not being paid enough to do them in the first place.
So if this goes through, you're going to have a permanent majority that is the recipient of welfare as we know it. And then we got to define welfare, because we have something there. And this is why politically it's also, some would say, untenable when you talk about the fact of, let's say, our entitlement programs. And we've talked about this, I think, in the last 6 months, you mentioned this, and you've mentioned it over the time. It's an outstanding point. But the entitlement programs that we've paid into, Social Security and Medicare, pay out about $130,000 plus dollars more than on average than people pay in. So you pay in X amount, you get more out. That's an equation that can't be sustained, can it?
No, of course not, and that's now. Remember that as long as we continue to have a system that isn't automatically tied to longevity, that number's only going to get worse. People are probably not aware of the fact that when Social Security was instituted and they said you begin collecting at age 65, the average lifespan of Americans at that point was 63. So they knew even at that point they were only willing to pay a subset of Americans who retired. Now the average life expectancy for Americans is somewhere between, I believe, 79 and 80. So you're already looking at 14 to 15 years of additional payments. And as you said, it's unsustainable.
Okay. With it not being sustainable. So some people, there's an idea that people like me, I'll just speak for myself, but a characterization of a right-wing talk show host is you're exaggerating, you're saying things for effect, you really don't believe in what you're saying, and you're hyperbolic. We've always had these challenges, and this is just another year of them, and you're just manufacturing outrage or concern. And so I'm going to ask you, because bottom line, I'm looking at the fact of my kids and I'm thinking they're going to have to pay for this, and they're going to pay for it in lack of opportunity, lack of capital, being able to reach people with innovative ideas for research. They're going to look to the government first as opposed to anything else, because government will be the source of capital money if they want to do that, and it's centrally planned. I digress. Here's my question. Is it worse than it's ever been, and are we at a tipping point, meaning that if it doesn't change in the next few elections, we're done?
Well, we're certainly at a number of different potential tipping points. I'll go that far. I mean, I don't think it's as bad as it's ever been. I've never lived through the Great Depression, so I can't personally attest to that. But what I've read, it was a pretty dire period in American history. I have to believe World War II was a pretty dire period in American history compared to what we're going through now. I tend to believe that a lot of what makes this seem so terrible is the fact that we tend to have a hysterical media, number one, and we also tend to have a population that I would consider somewhat softer than the people who dealt with the Depression or World War II. And I think those are contributing factors. But then again, the math doesn't lie. You know, people don't understand that right now we're paying somewhere between $300 and $400 billion a year just in interest on the existing debt, and that's at record low interest rates. And we've taken in record tax receipts that come to about $2.7, $2.8 trillion, and that's at the current tax rates, and the government still spends more than that by a factor of maybe 25 to 33%. And it doesn't take much for it to throw it off the rails. And, you know, it's funny because I think the biggest story of last week was not all of this stuff, was not the VA scandal, was not the assault on our southern borders, but the fact that the European Central Bank lowered their interest rate to a negative value, meaning that if you want to park your money in the European Central Bank, you now have to pay for the privilege of doing so. That's pretty scary.
It's frightening. Arnold, just to wrap up the welfare state point, out of the Great Depression, out of World War II, we had these programs initiated. They made them legal through gymnastics in the sense of what we saw with the Heverling case with Social Security, and then we see Medicare and its projections, and they knew this at the time. So speaking just to the welfare state that we've created, we've run its course, it's collapsing. Would you agree with that statement that mathematically we can't continue just by population demographics alone? It tells us that we have too few workers and too many retirees to sustain it.
Oh, there's no question about it. But again, this is the principal argument that the pro-immigration types, not just in here but in Europe, use to justify importing masses of third world immigrants, that we're going to need to have them there in order to finance the welfare state that we've already created. I mean, Europe's demographics are far worse than ours. They're nowhere near replacement birth rates over there. So they're going to hit that wall a lot sooner than we are. But that's what we're up against, and rather than reform the welfare state, they would prefer to sustain it by bringing in more and more people from outside. I would prefer to see a system rebuilt, a system where maybe you start contributing to your own retirement funds early, where you have a system of privatization like you have in some of the countries in South America that seems to be working pretty well, by the way. Sure. And just have a national conversation about what constitutes a genuine safety net as opposed to what's becoming more and more like a hammock instead of that safety net. I think that we've gone way overboard. There's always going to be a conversation in this country regarding who is deserving of help, you know, who is helpless versus hapless. That's the way I like to put it. And right now I think the hapless side is winning because there's a lot of people who are collecting benefits who have no business collecting benefits.
And if you do import the folks who ostensibly the reasoning behind it would be to support the welfare state, yet we see the cost in doing that, and it only exacerbates the overall problem. So
that's
you're
correct.
not okay. So you're not solving anything, and it seems for the last 40 plus years, general statement. But you mentioned the World War II generation, and I want to speak to this in the sense of we have lived off of their promise and their work and their labor, and we haven't done anything to revitalize what truly has made this country great. All we've done is tear it down and expand a government, a statist government coming in and saying we're going to give more. And so culturally speaking, are we at a point where there needs to be a shock to the system to understand how people are free, how money is made, because we're an incredibly wealthy country in the sense that government is spending so much. So at the heart of this, are we dealing with a cultural problem, not just mere economics problem?
Well, what you may call a cultural problem, and we've discussed this before, I prefer to call an ethical or a moral problem. And you know, while we are talking about the welfare state, I don't limit my disdain for the moral values strictly to the bottom rung of the ladder here. There's some people at the top who are taking advantage every bit as much as the people at the bottom. And again, it's like I said to you last week, if you have a country of 300 million plus people with no real clear idea, and I'm not saying everything has to be lockstep one after the other, but with no real clear idea of morality, you kind of get what you got. We're sort of making it up as we go along here, and I don't think that bodes well for the long term.
I don't think it bodes well for the long term either. And I want to highlight what you mentioned and those at the top who are benefiting from this. And what you have, it's odd, is obviously we can look at folks and look at human nature and say, hey, if you're going to pay me not to work and I'm going to work really, really hard and earn $10,000 less than I would not working, well, I got a family, I got to take care of things. I'm going to go to, hey, you're incentivizing this. I'm going to go with it. Not saying it's right. It's a reality. But when you talk about the people at the top who are manipulating the system, this is something that Dave Brat spoke to was the Wall Street versus Main Street, which I can't stand because I think it's populist garbage overall. But I do believe that there is crony capitalism, as you mentioned, and that's on steroids, as it existed certainly during the Bush administration and through any administration it's grown. It's been on steroids through the Obama administration. How do you wrestle that power away from influence that are benefiting and have people writing the legislation for them?
Well, I think that, again, the great irony here is that the bigger the government becomes, the more inclined the rent seekers are to try and curry favor with it, because the alternative is too disastrous to contemplate. So it sort of feeds on itself. I have a feeling I'm a supply sider. I have a feeling if you provide incentive to a large number of businesses, and by the way, we're talking about mostly small businesses here because they still employ more Americans than the large corporations. I think you have to incentivize good behavior as opposed to threaten to punish bad behavior. And I think that's part of where we've lost our way in this country. Yeah, you're always going to have your bad guys. I mean, you're going to have your guys who want to make a bazillion bucks even though they've already got a bazillion bucks, and because it's tied into their ego. But I don't think most people are like that. I still believe that most people are fundamentally honest and fundamentally decent unless you push them into a corner. And that's where I think we've gotten into this country. You see the people at the top who are basically ignoring the laws as written. You see the people at the bottom who are basically ignoring the laws as written, and you see the great masses in the middle going, what's going on here? Where do we turn to get any relief?
And the only way truly to address that, in my estimation, and tell me your thoughts on this, is we can speak to the idea of, lobbyists control this, lobby this, but you might be talking about small businesses banding together, having a lobbying voice to do this versus, big Wall Street, fat cats, whatever, or Goldman Sachs or whatever it may be. They're lobbyists of all sorts. Rather than cut off the lobbyists, cut off what draws the lobbyists in, which is the power of government. You've got to limit the power of government. Captain Obvious just joined the conversation. But how do you limit the power of government when the interests are there to not to create that demand for the limit of the power of government. Do you think we saw elements of that in the sense of the establishment being defeated with Dave Brat?
I certainly do. I think that was definitely a part of it. Again, I hate to say this, but it's the American public's responsibility to vote for the kind of government they want. Now, the fact that they were caught up in the moment in 2008 for a guy who was promising them hope and change, fine, I understand that. I'm a little less understanding of their determination to continue with another 4 years of it. But then again, you have to take it in the context of who the Republicans put up against Obama, and they continually insist on putting up what I call Democrat lights. I mean, I don't care where you stand ideologically in this country. I don't think there's too many Americans who really feel that a robust debate is a bad thing. I mean, I would like to see two clearly defined parties instead of what we have now, which is a Democratic Party that's been sort of hijacked, in my opinion, far more by radicals than the Republican Party have. I mean, Tea Party, T stands for taxed enough already. I don't think that's a radically groundbreaking idea that Americans feel like they're getting taxed enough already, especially when you start, toggling in everything, from, I mean, just paying tolls on the highway to, the extra tax they tax on your internet bill, all the way up through income taxes and all the rest of it. I get the sense that right now we're at a period of time where government feels entitled to your money before you are.
And there's Go ahead.
No, and I think that's just something that has to change.
I think you've hit it out of the park, truly, because you're saying there needs to be a choice, not socialism light, or however you want to put it. That people are looking for a choice and a robust debate. They got that in the one debate between Reagan and Carter, of all things, but I think it's much more pronounced than ever, and the need for it to be more pronounced than ever. It's not, and that's what you are speaking to. We need that debate, and we need that representation and that choice. R's or D's, not about R's or D's, about accountability, but we need a choice. Arnold Ahlert, thank you, man. We're out of time. I wish I had more. Great to be with you. Crane Durham.